It was just before dawn when I first noticed the silence. You don't really hear water when it flows through irrigation ditches, not unless you're a farmer and you've been waking up at 500 a.m. for 30 years. I've come to rely on that sound. It's like the breath of the land itself, whispering through valves and pipes, feeding the rows of kale and romaine that make up my livelihood. But that morning there was nothing, just dry, windless quiet. I pulled on my boots, the old cracked pair I've worn since my wife left, and stepped into the soft light creeping over the ridge. I walked past the barn, past the tool shed, toward the main canal, where the water from the state reservoir usually split off into channels across my acreage. But the channel was dry, bone dry. I blinked, thinking maybe I was wrong, maybe something had jammed up. I went further up the line, crouching by the rust-colored junction pipe where the flow usually surged like a small river. I ran my hand through the dust. No mud, no moisture, nothing. That's when the dread hit me. For a moment, I just stood there, heart pounding. I tried to think of logical reasons. A clog, a valve problem upstream, maybe maintenance at the county level. But I hadn't gotten any notice, and I'm always notified. Always. That's the thing about farming water isn't optional. It's life. And when it disappears without a trace, you feel like the oxygen's been sucked out of the air. I called the city water office around 700 a.m. when they opened. A tired-sounding clerk named Jill told me there were no scheduled outages or diversions in our zone. "I'm not seeing any change orders," she said. "You're in Sector 19A, right?" "Right." "Well, there's nothing on the books. Your water should be flowing." "It's not," I said. "Hasn't been since before dawn." There was a pause on the line. "Let me open a service request," she said, her voice suddenly more alert. "But you're not the first call we've had this week." I hung up and walked back to the house, but my boots felt heavier with each step. By midday, the lettuce was already wilting. The soil baked harder than it should have for early spring. I turned on the auxiliary tank pump, but it wouldn't last more than a few days. That water was for emergencies, not full irrigation. I tried not to panic. "I've seen worse," I told myself. I served in the Corps back in the 90s, did 2 tours in Afghanistan. I've stared down worse than a dry canal, but this was different. This was home. And home is where you're not supposed to be attacked, especially not by something invisible. By day 3, my neighbors started asking questions. "Hey Rick," said Mark the orchard guy, "2 lots over your ditch go dry too." I nodded. He looked concerned. "Same here. But get this up the hill, everything's lush. Lawns trimmed, sprinklers going full blast. Whole damn HOA is green as Ireland." I frowned. That HOA, Willow Creek Estates. Gated community built about a decade ago on the hill above my farm. They'd been trouble from the start, fighting over zoning lines, barking about nuisance odors from compost, trying to ban my roadside produce stand because it didn't match the neighborhood aesthetic. They never wanted farms down here. Just views. Still, I never thought they'd go this far. But then again, the water had to be going somewhere. On day 5, I got a knock at my door. It was Eva, my late brother's wife, the only family I had left in the county. She worked as a hydrology assistant for the city, basically boots on the ground. "I shouldn't be telling you this," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "But there's a new lateral branch coming off Line 7. It wasn't there last month. It leads directly into Willow Creek Estates." My stomach dropped. "You mean they tapped into the line?" She nodded. "Illegally, as far as I can tell. But someone pushed paperwork through without signatures. The file's missing half the approvals. Looks fishy as hell." I ran my hand down my face. My crops were already dying. Insurance wouldn't cover water theft. I'd be ruined, all while the folks in their stucco mansions watered rose gardens and filled fountains I helped pay for through county taxes. "Who signed the approvals?" I asked. She hesitated. "You won't like it. Councilman Brennan." I swore out loud. Brennan was HOA royalty. His sister was the board president. He'd been greasing palms for years, but this was a new low. I felt my jaw tighten, my breath quicken. It wasn't just theft, it was sabotage. They were trying to choke me out, kill the land, take the rest for themselves when I defaulted. But not this time. I stared at the hills that blocked my view of the stolen water, and something cold and razor-sharp settled into my chest. I'd played nice for years, gone to meetings, filed permits, let insults slide. But this was war. And they didn't know who they were messing with. The following morning, I drove my old Silverado up the winding road to Willow Creek Estates. It wasn't something I did often. That neighborhood always made my skin crawl. Gated, manicured, sterile, like someone tried to scrub all the life out of the countryside and replace it with concrete smiles and plastic flowers. The air smelled like chlorine and wealth, not dirt and sweat like down below. I punched in the visitor code at the gate, one I'd memorized from a time I delivered sweet corn to a friend who used to live up there. The arm lifted and I drove in slowly past symmetrical cul-de-sacs and beige mansions with Spanish tile roofs. And then I saw it, lawn after lawn, green as a spring meadow, not a brown patch in sight. Fountains flowed in front of 3 houses. One had an artificial stream running under a tiny bridge. Sprinklers clicked and hissed like snakes across the yards. It made me sick. I parked in front of the HOA clubhouse, a stucco monstrosity with faux pillars and a flagpole out front, and walked in. The air conditioning blasted so cold it made my sunburned skin ache. Behind the desk sat a woman with frozen blonde hair and a voice like vinegar. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to speak with your HOA board," I said, leveling my voice. "Name's Rick Thompson. I farm the land right below this community." Her lips pursed. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but I'm not leaving until I talk to someone." She tapped her pen on a notepad, clearly irritated. But a moment later, a man appeared from down the hall, tall. Late 50s, tan skin, expensive watch, smug smile. Alan Worthington, HOA vice president. I'd seen his name before in land complaints, zoning challenges, and nuisance filings against my farm stand. "Mr. Thompson," he said smoothly, extending a hand I didn't take. "We don't usually entertain unannounced visitors, but I suppose we can make an exception. What seems to be the issue?" "You know damn well what the issue is," I said. "My farm's canals are dry, water's gone, and yours." I waved a hand toward the window, is flowing like Niagara Falls. He raised an eyebrow. "Are you accusing us of something?" "I'm not accusing," I said. "I'm stating. I know about the illegal lateral. I know you're diverting water from Line 7 directly into this community. That's not just a civil violation. It's a felony under state resource law." His smile didn't falter, but his eyes hardened. "You sound upset. I've got acres of dying crops and a lien on my house. I'm not upset. I'm preparing to sue." There was a pause. Just for a second, the veneer cracked. Then he laughed. A slow, condescending laugh that bounced off the marble walls. "Mr. Thompson, if your farm's failing, I'd suggest you look into better irrigation practices. We're simply maintaining the community standard. Any assumptions you're making about our infrastructure are frankly baseless." "You think I don't know how to manage my land?" I snapped. "I've been farming that soil since you were sitting in boardrooms, approving faux Tuscan patios." I think he said, stepping closer, that perhaps you're looking for someone to blame. "And as for this lawsuit," he made air quotes, "I'd advise you to be very, very sure of your facts, because accusations like that can have consequences." I held his stare. "So can theft." I turned and walked out before I put my fist through one of their glass trophy cases. By the time I reached the gate, the arm didn't lift. The keypad blinked red. They'd already locked me out. Typical. I drove back down the hill, fists clenched on the steering wheel. When I pulled into my drive, I found Sheriff Morgan's cruiser waiting for me. "What now?" I muttered, climbing out. Morgan was decent, a little too friendly with the HOA for my liking, but not fully in their pocket. He removed his sunglasses, looking vaguely uncomfortable. "Rick, got a call about some aggressive behavior at the Willow Creek clubhouse." I scoffed. "Aggressive?" I walked in and told the truth. He scratched the back of his neck. "They say you threatened litigation." "Damn right I did." He looked at the dust-covered field behind me, then back at my face. "Look, I get it. I've heard things too about that new pipeline. But you can't just barge in there. What would you have me do? Let my land die while they sip water in hot tubs?" He sighed. "Just tread carefully. These folks have lawyers on retainer and friends on the planning commission. You stir too much, and they'll come after you first." "Let them try," I said. "This land's been in my family 3 generations. I'm not letting them bleed it dry." He didn't argue, just gave me a slow nod and drove off. That night, I stood at the edge of my field, watching the last rows of romaine curl into brittle brown. My hands were trembling from anger, yes, but something deeper too. The violation wasn't just legal or financial, it was personal. They weren't just stealing water, they were stealing my life. And they were smiling while they did it. That's when I decided, no more hesitation. No more waiting for agencies or permits or someone else to stand up. They wanted a fight. They just picked the wrong farmer. 2 days later, I found it. It wasn't luck, it was grit. I'd spent hours poring over old county water maps and infrastructure overlays. I'd walked ditches and traced the slope of the land like I was reading veins in the palm of the earth. I knew this terrain better than I knew my own face. And something hadn't been sitting right with me since Eva mentioned the lateral line. That's when I saw it, a narrow service trail running along the base of the HOA property, half covered in brush and weeds, like it hadn't been maintained in years. It wasn't on any HOA development map, but it was on the city's. I followed it just before dusk, when the light was low enough not to cast long shadows. The trail snaked behind the last row of homes on the west ridge of Willow Creek Estates, just beyond their manicured backyards, through a rusted maintenance gate chained shut with a padlock so old it had been overtaken by ivy. But the thing about rusted gates is, they don't hold well. I took a crowbar, wedged it just below the latch, and with one slow wrenching push, I cracked it open. The sound was loud in the quiet metal, crying out after years of silence, but no one came. Behind the fence, the path opened into a gravel maintenance zone. There, nestled between a row of concrete utility boxes, was a shining silver pipe. It wasn't part of the old layout. It wasn't even weathered. It was new, maybe 6 months old, with a pressure gauge blinking faintly, and a city seal that looked fake. I crouched beside it and placed my hand on the surface. It was cool, vibrating ever so slightly. That's when I heard it, the quiet hum of water pushing fast and steady through the line. This was it. This was the theft running like a bloodline straight from the city main, rerouted and buried out of sight, straight into Willow Creek Estates. I scanned for any signs of identification. No serial numbers, no work tags, no approval stickers. Someone had gone through a lot of trouble to make this look official, without making it traceable. I pulled out my phone and started taking photos. Wide shots, close-up shots of the pipe running beneath a fresh patch of disturbed dirt where they must have reburied the main trench. I got the fence, the broken lock, everything. And then I heard footsteps, not loud, hesitant. I spun around, half expecting a security guard or HOA rep, but it wasn't. It was a boy, maybe 13, thin with a crooked baseball cap and 2 big shoes. He froze when he saw me. "You're not supposed to be here," he said. I nodded slowly. "Neither are you." He hesitated. I sneak through sometimes. There's a shortcut to the bike trails." I lowered my voice. "Did you see who built this?" He looked past me at the pipe, then back at my face. "I saw a truck a few months ago. Big black one. No company logo. 2 guys in yellow vests. They only came at night. Had flashlights and shovels." That confirmed it. Whoever had laid this line knew what they were doing and who they were hiding it from. I pulled a business card from my wallet. Just an old one from the farmer's co-op with my name and number scribbled on the back. "If you remember anything else," I said, handing it to him, "call me. You won't get in trouble." He nodded, still wary, then disappeared down the trail. I stood there for a moment longer, staring at that gleaming pipe. My hands were shaking again, not from fear but from rage so deep it felt cellular. These people weren't just greedy. They were calculated, and they thought no one would ever find out. They were wrong. Back home, I backed up all the photos to a USB stick and 2 separate hard drives. Then I called Eva. "Meet me tomorrow," I told her. "Bring someone who knows city permits." She agreed, but her voice had that cautious edge. "Rick, this is big. You're poking a nest of snakes." "Good," I said. "Let them bite." The next morning, I returned to the site with Eva and her colleague, a tall woman named Carla, who worked in municipal engineering. As soon as she saw the pipe, her brow furrowed. "This isn't ours," she muttered. "Wrong grade steel, wrong coupling, and that seal's been forged." "You sure?" "Positive. Whoever did this bypassed at least 4 levels of approval. They tapped into the main without a backflow preventer. That's illegal as hell." Eva took photos too, more methodical, better angles. Carla began mapping the line with a handheld GIS scanner. "This wasn't just theft," Carla said after a few minutes. "It's environmental sabotage. If this ruptured, the runoff would flood the lower fields." I stared at her. "You mean my land?" She nodded gravely. "They didn't just steal your water. They endangered your soil, your crops, maybe even your house." I felt cold all over. They hadn't just wanted my water. They wanted me gone. By afternoon, Carla had filed a preliminary violation report. She couldn't promise action, not yet, but it was a start. A pebble dropped into the well. That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at my ceiling, listening to the creaks in the walls, the distant chirp of insects that had replaced the rustle of watered leaves. My land was drying out more by the hour, and those responsible were probably sipping Cabernet beside their fountains, believing they'd gotten away with it. But they didn't count on one thing. I wasn't done. I was just getting started. I didn't go in guns blazing. That's not how you deal with people like this. HOA boards don't respond to fists, they respond to power. Quiet, deliberate, merciless power. And I was ready to speak in their language. The next board meeting was posted online, buried deep in the Willow Creek Estates HOA portal. I had Eva's friend Carla print me a certified copy of the preliminary violation report stamped with the city engineer's office seal. It was dense, full of technical jargon and hydrological terms, but I had underlined the only sentence that mattered. Unauthorized diversion of municipal water source confirmed. Civil and criminal liabilities pending. I printed copies, 10 of them, and I brought them with me when I walked into that meeting. It was a Wednesday evening. The clubhouse was packed. A few dozen residents, most of them sun-tanned and comfortable, sat sipping flavored water and fanning themselves with HOA newsletters. The board sat behind a long oak table, framed by flags, and a ridiculous bronze eagle statue. Alan Worthington, the smug vice president from before, sat dead center, flanked by Karen Brennan, the HOA president and sister of Councilman Brennan, and 2 other board members I'd seen only in documents. I walked in, made no eye contact, and took a seat in the back row. Some of the residents glanced at me, uncertain. A few recognized me as the farmer down the hill and whispered to each other. Alan began the meeting with practiced smoothness. Before we begin tonight's agenda, I'd like to remind our residents that this is a closed HOA meeting for members only. I said standing up and holding up a parcel file. This HOA is listed as a stakeholder in a county water access dispute. I'm here to speak on record. He flinched just barely and then tried to recover with a smile. I'm afraid this isn't the appropriate venue for... This board, I interrupted, walking forward, has authorized either directly or through forged documentation the illegal diversion of municipal water from Sector 19A into Willow Creek Estates' private irrigation system. That diversion caused the failure of irrigation lines on my legally owned farm, leading to the loss of hundreds of acres of produce, 2 lawsuits, and an environmental violation report now filed with the city. I laid the folder in front of him like a police officer slapping down a warrant. Karen Brennan shifted in her seat, lips drawn tight. "You're making serious accusations," she said. "They're not accusations," I said. "They're facts. Documented, mapped, and confirmed by 2 separate municipal engineers." Alan didn't touch the folder. "Mr. Thompson, if you're trying to intimidate..." "I don't need to intimidate anyone," I said, "because this is going to court, and the only reason I'm here is to offer your board a choice." I turned to face the room, not the board, but the residents. They looked uncomfortable. They always did when things turned real. But a few leaned forward listening. "I've already filed suit. Civil damages. I'll be naming the HOA specific board members and any city officials who approved the permit under false pretenses. But if this board wants to avoid criminal prosecution, and more importantly, if the residents want to avoid massive community fines, then you have 72 hours to shut off the illegal line, remove the pipe, and issue a formal apology." There was a stunned silence. Then someone in the back, a younger woman, maybe late 30s, raised her hand timidly. "Wait, we're using stolen water." Alan glared at her, but she ignored him. "My son's been watering our garden every day. Are you saying that water came from his farm?" I looked at her. "Yes. And it's killing his land." Gasps, whispers. Karen snapped, "This isn't a public forum." "It is now," I said loud enough to carry. "You stole life from my land. You covered it up. And when I came to you with the truth, you tried to threaten me." Another man stood. "What about our dues? Are we paying for stolen utilities?" "Silence," Karen barked. "Mr. Thompson, you are out of line." I stepped closer to the table. "No, you're out of line. You crossed onto my land with your paperwork and your fake seals and your damned entitlement. But the thing about land is it remembers. Every tree, every inch of pipe you buried, every gallon you stole my soil remembers." Her face reddened. "Security," she snapped. I smirked. "Already tried that. Ask Sheriff Morgan why he dropped the complaint." As I turned to leave, I laid one last copy of the violation report on the front table for any resident who wanted to see it. Then I walked out. No one followed. Outside, the air felt cooler, cleaner. I looked up at the clubhouse roofline, saw the faint gleam of copper pipe glinting in the floodlight, and thought of the thousands of gallons that had passed through it stolen drop by stolen drop. They thought I wouldn't fight back. They thought I'd fold just another farmer with dirt under his nails and no money to hire lawyers. They forgot one thing. I'd spent half my life fighting in deserts overseas. I knew what a real drought looked like, and I was just getting warmed up. The lawsuit was filed. The documents were served. The engineer's report was in the hands of city officials and the local newspaper. But none of that stopped the water from being gone. The earth doesn't care about paperwork. The morning after the HOA meeting, I walked the perimeter of my farm and felt every step like a bruise. The soil had gone from dry to cracked. Fissures ran through the upper beds where I used to grow spring spinach, the kind restaurants fought over. The lettuce rows were dead. Not wilted dead. Crisp and crumbling like dried leaves in October. I tried to salvage what I could. I rerouted the emergency tank's rationed water to just the tomatoes and peppers, but it wasn't enough. I'd missed the window. No water meant no roots, and no roots meant nothing to harvest. The numbers started eating at me. 4 acres of greens gone. Another 5 of root vegetables spoiled. The onions never even had a chance. I had contracts lined up for 2 local markets, a school district, and a private catering company in the city. I'd already spent the deposits on seeds labor and fuel. With nothing to deliver, I was liable for every cent. I sat at my kitchen table staring at a pile of invoices I couldn't pay and trying not to scream. Then the letters started arriving. Late payment notices. Insurance claim denials. A warning from the bank about a potential lien. One morning, a man in a blue blazer showed up unannounced and left a foreclosure pre-notice folded under my porch mat. I wasn't just losing a season. I was losing everything. By week 2, the worst part wasn't the money. It was the silence from the land. A farm isn't just a business. It breathes with you. It listens when you speak under your breath in the morning and accepts your curses in the heat of the afternoon. But now when I walked the rows, all I heard was wind. No buzzing of insects, no creak of water hoses, no rustle of vines. Just stillness. Like the land had given up too. Mark, my neighbor, came by one night with a 6-pack and sat on the tailgate of my truck. He didn't say much. Just cracked open a can and passed it to me. "You gonna be okay?" he asked after a long silence. I looked out over the field. "I don't know," I said honestly. "You've got people rooting for you. Doesn't bring the water back." "No," he said, staring into his drink. "But it might stop them from doing this to anyone else." That hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just about my farm anymore. What the HOA did, what they tried to cover up, it was part of something bigger. If they could do this to me, a lifelong landowner with military service and a clean record, what chance did the next guy have? They hadn't just attacked my livelihood. They'd attacked the principle that your land is yours, that your sweat means something. Later that week, I drove into town to meet with Sarah Wexler, an agricultural lawyer known for her tenacity and her refusal to be bullied, especially by HOAs and corrupt developers. She looked over my files in silence for almost 20 minutes. When she finally spoke, it was like a blade slicing the tension in half. "They're screwed," she said. I blinked. "What?" "This is one of the clearest cases of malicious infrastructure manipulation I've seen. You've got photographic evidence, a signed violation report, and let me guess, they've already tried to intimidate you. They called the sheriff on me after I confronted them. Said I was aggressive." She smirked. "Classic. That's going to backfire. Especially once we subpoena city council records and find out who approved the lateral line without a vote." "I can't afford a long trial," I said. "They've already bled me dry." "That's the thing," she said, leaning forward. "They're going to want to settle, but not because they care about you. Because if this goes public, and trust me, I'll make sure it does, every single one of their residents is going to be liable for HOA-funded illegal construction. No one wants their HOA dues tripling overnight to cover litigation damages." I felt something I hadn't in weeks. Hope. Small, fragile, but real. She took my case pro bono for the first 90 days, enough time to file injunctive relief and push for expedited hearings. She even had a contact at the local news station who agreed to cover the story once it hit the docket. That night, I walked the field again. It was still dead, still broken. But I carried a small notebook in my pocket and began sketching what I'd plant next season when the water came back. I scribbled plans for drip lines and drought-resistant crops. I made notes about regrading the north bed for runoff collection. I even jotted down ideas for a new community program, maybe teaching kids from the HOA what real land stewardship looked like. Not to shame them, but to prove something deeper. That land-like people can heal, even after betrayal, even after silence, even after drought. The deeper we dug, the dirtier it got. I thought I'd seen corruption before. After all, I'd been stationed in regions where bribes flowed faster than water, where the only laws that mattered were the ones enforced by who had more bullets. But this was different. This was happening 5 miles from a farmer's market and a Baptist church. Sarah Wexler worked fast. She filed subpoenas against the HOA's water committee, a subdivision of the board that had somehow approved the infrastructure work without resident vote or proper documentation. That committee, as it turned out, consisted of exactly 2 people, Alan Worthington and Karen Brennan. Their names kept showing up. First in meeting minutes where projects were discussed but never officially voted on. Then in vague financial reports, line items buried under emergency landscaping expenses and community beautification budget reallocations. And finally in emails. Lots of them. Eva managed to get her hands on a partial thread between Councilman Brennan and Karen Brennan. The email was laced with euphemisms, expedited approval mitigating resident dissatisfaction, and the worst one, water redistribution to protect property value perception. Water redistribution. That's what they called theft now. But one email stood out. Dated 6 months prior, it was sent from a private server and marked confidential. It read, "As long as the upstream property owner remains unaware, the line should go unnoticed. If resistance arises, we'll use nuisance citations to discredit and pressure for land sale." I read that line 10 times. Upstream property owner, that was me. And use nuisance citations. They meant all those letters I'd gotten over the years. The fines for dust from my driveway. The noise complaints from tractor engines. The safety hazard report on my compost bin. They'd been building a paper trail trying to make me look like a troublemaker. Not just to frustrate me, but to position themselves for a land grab. They weren't just stealing water. They were trying to drive me out so they could take the land. My land. 3 generations worth of calloused hands and sweat. Sarah forwarded the email to the State Attorney General's office. That same week, I got a call from a reporter named Dana Ortega with the Herald-Sun. She'd caught wind of the case from the court filings and wanted to run a Sunday feature. I invited her out to the farm. When she arrived, I took her to the edge of the lower field and showed her where the canal had dried up. I showed her the cracked valve, the useless irrigation lines, the piles of produce I couldn't save. She walked in silence, scribbling notes, snapping photos. But it wasn't until I showed her the printouts, the fake permits, the falsified maps, the confidential email that her eyes went wide. "Holy hell," she whispered. "This isn't just civil fraud, this is criminal conspiracy." "Welcome to Willow Creek Estates," I said. The story went live 2 days later under the headline, "HOA accused of water theft and land sabotage, farmer fights back." It spread fast. Local radio picked it up. Then state news. Even an agriculture blog in D.C. posted a summary and called it a case study in HOA overreach and rural resistance. That's when the calls started coming in. From other farmers, from homeowners who'd been bullied by their associations, from a retired county judge who offered to consult on the case pro bono, even from a man in Arizona who'd once fought a similar battle and said they always count on you being alone. You're not. One night as I was sorting mail in the kitchen, Eva showed up at my doorstep out of breath. "They're shredding documents," she said. "What?" "At the clubhouse, back office." I was doing an inspection on a city project next door, and I saw a staffer wheeling in 3 industrial shredders. I grabbed my truck keys. When we got there, the lights were on in the main hall. I parked across the street and used my phone to start recording from the window. Inside, 2 men in polos were feeding armloads of paper into the machines. Cardboard boxes marked HOA maintenance archives and permits 2023 were already half empty. Eva made a call to her contact in the city compliance office. They authorized a preservation order within the hour. The next morning, investigators arrived and seized what was left. 2 hard drives, 1 laptop, and a shredded pile of what might have been permit approvals gone. But we still had the emails, we still had the photos, and we had something stronger now. Public outrage. Residents of Willow Creek Estates were furious. They flooded the next board meeting, demanding answers, threatening to recall the entire HOA leadership. Karen didn't even show up. Alan tried to speak but was shouted down by a woman holding her dead hydrangeas in a bucket. "You watered your lawn with lies," she yelled. "We trusted you." The board adjourned in chaos. It was the first time I saw them break. Not in court, not in silence, but in front of the people they were supposed to serve. And I realized they hadn't just lost water. They'd lost control. It wasn't the kind of thing I ever imagined doing. Me, a dirt under the fingernails kind of guy, sitting at a long oak table across from 3 attorneys in suits that probably cost more than my pickup. But there I was, button-down ironed hands folded documents stacked in neat piles with tabs and highlights. My name, Richard M. Thompson, printed across the top of the plaintiff's filing in bold font. Thompson v. Willow Creek Estates, HOA, Alan Worthington, Karen Brennan, and John Doe's 110. Sarah sat beside me, calm and composed, tapping her pen gently on the tabletop. We were in preliminary mediation court-mandated before formal hearings. The HOA had finally agreed to meet, not because they wanted to, but because public pressure was mounting, and their residents were demanding answers they couldn't give. Across from us sat their legal team, 3 polished faces from a white-collar firm out of Sacramento. Beside them, Alan Worthington tried to maintain that same smug look from the board meeting, but it didn't stick anymore. The cameras, the headlines, the public fallout, it had all taken its toll. His tie looked too tight. His palms never stopped fidgeting. Karen Brennan wasn't even present. She'd resigned quietly 2 days earlier. A 3-line email posted to the HOA website blamed stress slander and a toxic political climate. I nearly laughed when I read it. The truth was, she knew the walls were closing in. The mediator, a judge with a long gray braid and a reputation for fairness, opened the session. "We're here today to seek resolution," she said. "Let's begin with the plaintiff's opening." Sarah nodded to me. I cleared my throat. "I've lived on my land for 32 years. I've grown food for this community, paid taxes to this county, and maintained water rights that predate every home in Willow Creek Estates." I paused, letting my eyes sweep the table. 2 months ago, my irrigation lines went dry. I found out not through warning or notice, but through my own investigation, that the water had been diverted. Illegally. Secretly. That redirection caused the destruction of my crops, loss of my income, and risked foreclosure on land that's been in my family since my grandfather first plowed it after the war. One of their lawyers interrupted. "Mr. Thompson, with all due respect." I raised a hand firm. "You'll have your turn." He fell silent. Sarah handed over a folder. "This is a copy of the violation report from the city engineer. It confirms that the lateral line diverting water to Willow Creek Estates was constructed without approval, backflow preventers, or legal permits. Attached are images time-stamped and sworn witness testimony." The judge opened the file. "We are seeking damages in the amount of $487,000 to cover lost revenue restoration costs, legal fees, and punitive measures." One of the HOA lawyers adjusted his glasses. "That number is conservative," Sarah said coolly. "Frankly, we're being generous. If this goes to full trial, we'll also seek criminal referrals and civil action against Councilman Brennan for conspiracy and fraud." That shut them up. The mediator turned to the defense. "Your response." The lead attorney leaned forward. "We are open to discussing settlement, but the HOA maintains that individual board members were unaware of the extent of the infrastructure project." I laughed. "You're telling me a half-mile pipeline was installed underground through gated property, and nobody on the board knew?" Alan flinched. Sarah turned to him. "Mr. Worthington, would you like to confirm whether your signature was on this work order?" She slid across a document, one she'd obtained through a whistleblower 2 weeks earlier. Alan's name was printed clearly at the bottom. His mouth opened, then closed. The silence in that room was surgical. By the end of the session, no agreement was reached, but we didn't expect one. What we wanted was pressure, and we got it. That evening, I found myself watching the local news again. Dana Ortega stood in front of the county courthouse, her microphone catching the edge of her excitement. Today, a farmer from Riverview Valley took on one of the most powerful HOAs in the region. Armed with documents and community support, Richard Thompson is making headlines as the man who fought back not just for his land, but for water rights across the state. Emails poured in. People I didn't know, families from the Valley veterans, single mothers, retired ranchers, writing to say they stood with me. A man in Southern California sent me a list of legislative contacts pushing for new HOA accountability laws. A lawyer in Nevada offered to testify as an expert on rural water law. Even some Willow Creek Estates residents reached out ashamed of what their board had done in their name. But it wasn't over. The real hearing was set for 2 weeks out, and the HOA was trying every trick in the book. They filed for continuance, claimed procedural errors, hired a PR firm to clean up their image. I stayed the course. Each day I walked my land dry as it was and spoke to it like I always had, told it what was coming, what we were fighting for. And each night I added new pages to my folder, new evidence, new names, new connections. One evening, just before sundown, Eva came by with an envelope in hand. "You're gonna want to see this," she said, eyes glowing. Inside was a letter from the State Water Resources Board. RE Review of Complaint, number 2025-14. After investigation, this agency confirms that water diversion by Willow Creek Estates, HOA, constitutes an unauthorized use of public resource infrastructure. Administrative enforcement actions to follow. Below it, a second line. Recommended for criminal referral. I leaned back against the porch railing and stared out at the land glowing amber in the dying light. We weren't just winning. We were about to turn the tide. The thing about water is it has a way of reminding people who really holds the power. When it flowed, the folks up in Willow Creek Estates acted like gods. Sprinklers danced across manicured lawns. Backyard fountains trickled into koi ponds. Every fourth house had one of those pretentious infinity edge pools that spilled over into views of the valley. They bathed their dogs in filtered rainwater and complained if a garden hose sputtered for more than 3 seconds. But when the state finally intervened, when that shiny silver pipeline I'd uncovered was capped and cut at the source, those same gods learned what it meant to live in drought. And they did not take it well. Within 3 days of the enforcement order, the fountains went dry. HOA maintenance trucks scrambled to hook up backup water tanks, but county regulators blocked them. The entire community was placed under emergency restriction pending a full audit of usage records and permit violations. At first, they tried to spin it. We're voluntarily conserving their website chirped. But then came the brown lawns. Then the cracked pavement, where runoff used to cool the asphalt in the summer. Then the letters from landscaping companies canceling services due to client non-compliance. And finally, the residents started calling the news stations themselves. I watched it all unfold from my porch, sipping coffee while reporters hovered just outside the gates of Willow Creek Estates, interviewing furious homeowners who demanded to know why their HOA dues were funding legal settlements and water theft investigations. One woman wrapped in a silk robe, with curlers still in her hair, shouted into the microphone, "We pay over $700 a month. My roses are dying and no one's explaining anything." Another man dressed like he'd just come from a golf course stood beside his bone-dry pool and said, "We've lived here 12 years. No one told us they were stealing. We want our money back." The HOA board tried to hold a press conference on the steps of the clubhouse. Only Alan Worthington showed up. Karen was long gone. The rest had either resigned or gone silent. Alan stepped up to the mic, cleared his throat, and began a speech filled with vague phrases like unintended consequences, oversight, and community resilience. He didn't get past his second sentence. A group of angry residents started booing. Someone threw a dried-up clump of turf at the podium. Someone else shouted, "Give the farmer his damn water back." I'll admit I smiled. Because while my land was still recovering, while my debts were still real, something had shifted. The imbalance of power had cracked, and they felt it deeply. One afternoon, I got a call from a man named David Klein. He was a financial auditor from the state's HOA regulatory board, a position I hadn't even known existed until this all began. He asked if I'd be willing to provide a sworn affidavit about the HOA's water use and the pressure they'd applied to force me off my land. Gladly, I said. But if you want the full picture, you should talk to some of their own residents. They've got more to say than I do. And they did. Turns out, I wasn't the only one they'd tried to manipulate. 2 former HOA staffers came forward with stories about doctored expense reports and off-the-books contractors. One had emails confirming Karen Brennan had personally requested the lateral water line under the alias Landscape Improvement Initiative. Then came the lawsuit not from me, but from within. A group of 19 Willow Creek Estates homeowners filed a class action suit against the board for fraud, negligence, and misuse of funds. They demanded a full audit of HOA operations, restitution for rising dues, and the immediate removal of all current board members. Suddenly, I wasn't the outsider anymore. I was the proof. The name Thompson was being whispered not as the stubborn farmer down the hill, but as the man who saw it first, who dared to say it loud, who stood when no one else would. One evening, as I was walking the property line near the North Canal, where the water had just begun to trickle back in from the main city line, I saw a woman waiting by the fence. It was the same young mother from the first board meeting, the one who had asked, "Are we using stolen water?" She held a small bundle in her arms, a basket wrapped in cloth. "I hope it's okay," she said. I wanted to thank you." She handed me the basket. Inside was a dozen eggs, fresh bread, and a jar of homemade jam. "I didn't know," she said quietly. "None of us did." "You know now," I said. "We replaced the board," she added. "Held an emergency vote. We're trying to fix it, starting with an apology." She reached into her pocket and handed me a letter typed and signed by the newly appointed interim board. It was short but honest, a formal acknowledgement of the theft, a commitment to transparency, a request for forgiveness. I didn't say anything for a while. Then I looked her in the eyes and said, "Make sure this never happens again. To anyone." She nodded. "We will." After she left, I walked back to the house and set the basket on the counter. Outside, the air smelled different. Not just dust and heat, but something cooler, cleaner. There was water flowing again in the main ditch. Not much, just a trickle, but it was real. And it was mine. My land might take seasons to heal. But justice? Justice had already begun to bloom. Courtrooms have a smell. Not just old wood and disinfectant, something colder, sharper. Like dust that's never been allowed to settle. Like the ghosts of arguments past, still hanging in the corners waiting to see how the next one ends. That morning, I wore my father's suit. It didn't fit perfect sleeves, a little tight in the shoulders waist, a little loose, but it carried weight. He wore it when he bought this land, when he fought the county over a water meter dispute back in the 70s. I figured it had one more round left in it. Sarah met me on the courthouse steps, clipboard in hand, glasses perched just so. Calm as always, but I could see the fight in her eyes. She wasn't just representing me anymore, she was standing for every small landowner who'd ever been brushed aside by people with money, lawyers, and artificial lawns. Inside the courtroom, the HOA's defense looked like a parade of defeat. Their new legal team was smaller, quieter. No flashy ties, no smug smirks. Alan Worthington sat hunched at the defense table, staring straight ahead like a man waiting for the axe. Karen Brennan wasn't there. Rumor was she'd fled to Arizona. Good riddance. The judge, a woman named Marisol Vega, took the bench promptly at 10:00 a.m. Her reputation was sharp but fair, and she'd clearly read every page of our filings. The room was full. Not just reporters and HOA residents, but farmers from upstate, environmental lawyers. Even a group of high schoolers on a field trip sat in the back, wide-eyed. Sarah stood first. She opened with no theatrics. "This is not a case about grass," she said. "It is not about landscaping or neighborhood aesthetics. This is a case about theft. About the calculated redirection of a public resource, water, from its lawful path to an illegal, privately enjoyed system. And the destruction that followed in its wake." She laid it all out. The fake permits, the hidden pipe, the environmental violations, the internal emails about nuisance citations and land pressure strategies. She handed over the damage assessments, the engineer reports, the sworn testimony. Even the grainy footage I'd taken of the HOA shredding documents late at night. Then she sat down. And for a moment, the courtroom was silent. The HOA's lawyer stood, a younger man, this time clearly hired in a hurry. He stammered through a weak argument about miscommunication and good faith intentions. He tried to pin the blame on rogue contractors and insufficient oversight. The judge wasn't having it. "Are you telling this court," she asked, voice like steel, "that a half-mile unauthorized water line was installed, funded, and connected to city mains, and not a single board member reviewed the work order?" He swallowed hard. "There may have been oversights." She turned back to Sarah. Counsel, your relief request includes civil penalties, injunctive relief, and punitive damages. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor. And do you have a sum total? Sarah nodded. $487,000. And a court order requiring the full removal of all unauthorized water infrastructure at the HOA's expense. The judge leaned back. She glanced over the room, then down at her notes. She didn't take long. In the matter of Thompson v. Willow Creek Estates, HOA, she began this court fines in favor of the plaintiff. A murmur swept the courtroom. The evidence presented clearly demonstrates willful misconduct, falsification of municipal documentation, and illegal diversion of public utilities. The defendant is ordered to pay the full amount of requested damages, in addition to punitive fines totaling $125,000 to be paid to the County Environmental Restoration Fund. Alan's face turned a shade paler. The judge continued, her voice unflinching. Furthermore, the court refers this matter to the District Attorney's Office for criminal investigation of fraud, conspiracy, and environmental violations. Should criminal charges be filed, this court will cooperate fully with any ongoing proceedings. She brought the gavel down once firm and final. Court adjourned. And just like that, it was done. I didn't cheer. I didn't pump my fist. I just let out a long, quiet breath I felt like I'd been holding for months. Sarah squeezed my shoulder, and I nodded at her words, failing. Outside the courthouse, a wall of cameras and microphones waited. Reporters shouted my name. One asked, "Do you feel vindicated?" Another yelled, "What's next for you, Mr. Thompson?" I looked into the camera. Not angry, not proud, just steady. I just want my land back. And I want the people who thought they could take it to understand we're not invisible. I turned and walked away. No more speeches. Back home, the sun was sinking low behind the ridge. I walked to the northern ditch, the one where the new flow had started to return, slow but steady. The water glittered in the twilight. I crouched, dipped my hand in it, felt its coolness run through my fingers. I whispered to the dirt like my father used to. "She's coming back," I said. "We're coming back." In the mailbox was a check, the first installment from the judgment. But more importantly, there was a letter from a nonprofit environmental group offering to help with land rehabilitation, no strings attached. Said they'd read the story, said they wanted to help. I stood on the porch watching the stars come out one by one the way they always had. The HOA had been judged. But more than that, the land had been heard. There's something sacred about the way the land forgives. Not quickly, not easily. But when you give it time, when you return to it with humility, instead of control, with sweat, instead of schemes, it begins to trust you again. The first true rain came 3 weeks after the judgment. Not a storm, not a deluge, just a long, soft soak. I watched it from my porch with a mug of black coffee, steam curling into the crisp morning air. The drops fell slow and steady, tapping on the tin roof like an old friend knocking after a long absence. By then, the illegal pipeline was gone, excavated and hauled off by contractors under court order. A small backhoe rolled over the last segment as I watched from the ridge. The metal snapped like bones. Eva stood beside me that day. "It's over," she said. "Almost," I replied. The real work was just beginning. I started small. I turned the soil by hand in the northeast corner where the romaine used to grow. The drought had hardened it into something like ceramic. But when I cut into it with a spade, I found a layer underneath that was still soft, still alive. I began working that patch each morning before the sun got too high. Neighbors stopped by Mark, of course, but also new faces. A couple from town brought compost. An old man donated a set of tools that had belonged to his father. A local teacher dropped off a box of seeds with a note. "Let the kids plant something here someday." I cried reading that. Not the loud kind. The kind that comes quiet behind the barn where no one can see. Sarah came back once to visit. She didn't stay long, had another case in Fresno, but before she left, she handed me a manila envelope. Inside was a photocopy of a new state bill sponsored by a group of legislators who'd read my story. It was called the Land Stewardship and HOA Accountability Act. It required third-party audits for any HOA infrastructure projects involving public utilities. It increased fines for illegal diversion. Most importantly, it created a grant fund for small farmers who'd been affected by abuse of power. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. She smiled and left me to it. By midsummer, my rows began to show signs of green. Not like before, not the kind of abundance that filled crates and trucks, but enough. Enough to make you believe again. Enough to remind the birds to return and the bees to circle. Enough to tell the soil I'm still here. One morning, I noticed something unusual on the fence line. A small group of kids stood with clipboards led by a young teacher from the local school. They were sketching, observing. One raised her hand and asked, "Is this where the water theft happened?" I chuckled. "Yeah," I said, "right about there." But this is also where it ended. I invited them in. We spent the afternoon walking rows. I showed them how to tell good soil from bad, how to see where roots would take, how to kneel and listen to the wind without hearing traffic. The kids asked questions, not the kind adults ask. The good kind, the kind that comes without judgment. Do plants forgive people? Can trees be mad? What if the water doesn't trust us again? I didn't have all the answers, but I told them what I'd come to believe. That the land doesn't hold grudges, it just remembers. And remembering is how it teaches. That fall, I had just enough of a harvest to hold a stand again. Not big. A simple table by the road with a hand-painted sign that read, "Back from the drought. Take what you need. Pay what you can." People came. From town. From neighboring farms. Even a few from Willow Creek Estate's new board members, young couples folks who'd heard about what happened and wanted to see it with their own eyes. Some brought food in return. Others left notes. One man handed me a folded piece of paper and said, "You kept the creek alive for all of us." I unfolded it after he left. It was a sketch pencil on lined notebook paper of a tree growing out of dry ground, its roots reaching deep into a single glowing stream beneath the surface. He'd signed it simply "A Neighbor." There are days I still struggle. Debt doesn't vanish overnight. And scars don't heal just because justice is served. But there's something new now, something honest. When I walk my land, I don't feel bitterness anymore. I feel purpose. When the wind brushes my face, I don't flinch, I breathe. And when I look out over those once dry fields and see green returning, I remember what it means to stand your ground, even when the world tells you to fold. I didn't win because I yelled the loudest. I won because I refused to be silent. Because I listened to the land. Because I let it teach me how to fight and how to forgive. And now, as the creek runs quietly beside the rows I've begun to replant, I know one thing for sure. This land doesn't just belong to me. I belong to it. And no HOA, no matter how powerful, will ever change that again.